A DIY recession, that's the danger of quitting the EU, says Cameron. But the Prime Minister's warning of a self-inflicted downturn in the economy provokes anger from the Leave camp and throws Boris into a spin.
This could be, for the first time in history, a recession brought on ourselves.
I think that they're rattled on the Remain side of the campaign because they're putting out more propaganda.
Also tonight, the restaurant owner jailed for 6 years for the manslaughter of a customer with a nut allergy.
Moving north, Mourinho prepares for United after Van Gaal gets the boot.
And turning the garden red, how the Chelsea Flower Show is honouring the fallen.
This is the ITV Evening News with Mark Austin and Mary Nightingale.
Good evening. David Cameron and George Osborne ramped up the tensions in the Europe debate today, saying a vote to quit was the self-destruct option. Using new Treasury figures, they claimed leaving the EU could tip Britain into a year-long recession, costing almost 1 million jobs.
But the leading Leave campaigner, Boris Johnson, attacked the predictions, saying the Treasury has been wrong in the past and it is wrong now. Propaganda, he called it. With just over 30 days until the polls open, here's our political correspondent Carl Dinnan on the latest referendum row.
The Treasury predicts an immediate and profound economic shock if we vote to leave the EU 1 month from today, with rising unemployment, falling wages and a shrinking economy. Not that they're trying to scare us, of course. But at a DIY firm in Hampshire, the Prime Minister and Chancellor sounded like a double act of doom.
The shock to our economy after leaving Europe would tip the country into recession.
The economy shrinks, the value of the pound falls, inflation rises,
businesses freeze up, confidence drains,
unemployment rises, real wages are hit.
This could be, for the first time in history, a recession brought on ourselves. As I stand here in B&Q, it would be a DIY recession.
The Treasury modelled 2 levels of economic disturbance, and even the milder shock scenario predicts an economy 3.6% smaller, unemployment 500,000 higher, and wages 2.8% lower than they would otherwise have been over the next 2 years. A more severe shock scenario envisages GDP 6% lower, unemployment 800,000 higher, and wages down 4%. But the Treasury has been wrong before, so why should anybody believe this?
This comes after very similar warnings from a number of independent organisations. So the Treasury is not today saying something radical or unexpected.
And the economists most trusted to mark the Treasury's homework agree, up to a point.
The Treasury severe shock scenario is certainly at the top end of what other people have suggested, and things might not be quite as bad even as their, quotes, shock scenario, but something in that order of magnitude one might reasonably expect.
But Leave campaigners, including this former Chancellor, say the figures are fixed.
Their only strategy is to scare us rigid, to scare the pants off us all. What they have done is assumed a disaster. It's pure assumption. And then the analysis is merely a matter of spelling out the details.
This is just wild speculation. We are giving the facts. The facts are that we don't control every week 360 million or 350 million pounds which goes to the EU. We can't control our immigration policy.
Mr Johnson was then taken for a spin. But the problem with too much spin, of course, is it tends to obscure what's really going on. Carl Dinnan, ITV News.
So, is it spin or something we should be worried about? Our political editor, Robert Peston, is in Downing Street. And Robert, I'm tempted to say, here we go again, that familiar question, what should we believe?
Well, economic predictions are only as good as the assumptions they're based on, and you know, those who want us to leave the EU say that the Treasury is being unnecessarily gloomy. In particular, it does not in these predictions expect the Bank of England to do anything to revive the economy were this downturn to happen. So it doesn't assume that the Bank of England would cut interest rates or make it cheaper and easier for banks to lend. Now, I have to say, I think that's bonkers. I think the Bank of England would take evasive action. Equally, the Treasury assumes that it would be extraordinarily difficult to regain full access to the European Union's single market for our exporters and to recreate some 50 trade deals across the world. Some people think, again, it is being unnecessarily gloomy, although our own commissioner in Brussels, Lord Hill, said to me that he agrees with the Treasury on this. Where does it leave us? Well, I think the weight of economists' view is that there would be a bit of a shock to the British economy, but even the Treasury, let's be clear, the numbers sound big, but we are not talking about anything remotely as severe or as damaging as what happened in 2008 after the banking crisis.
All right, Robert, thank you very much indeed.
The owner of an Indian restaurant is tonight starting a 6-year prison sentence after being found guilty of killing a customer with a severe peanut allergy. Paul Wilson died after eating a takeaway curry that he'd been assured did not contain any peanuts.
In fact, the owner, Mohammed Zaman, had cut corners by using cheaper ingredients and had ignored warnings that what he was doing could kill. From North Yorkshire, Peter Smith reports.
Paul Wilson had a peanut allergy. So when he went into his local takeaway for a curry, he made it clear the meal needed to be nut-free. That instruction was understood because staff wrote "no nuts" on both Paul's receipt and on the lid of his meal. But there were enough peanuts in the dish to put Paul into anaphylactic shock after just one bite. He was found dead in his home.
I've lost a son. I've lost my best friend.
I do think that it could have been avoidable if, by checking the products.
Today, a court agreed Paul's death was avoidable, and the restaurant owner, Mohammed Zaman, has been jailed for 6 years. Zaman was the one who called his suppliers to switch ingredients from this almond powder, which is safe even if you've got a peanut allergy, to a cheaper version that contains peanuts. The suppliers told him he'd have to tell customers it contained nuts, but he didn't bother. This was the Indian Garden restaurant in Easingwold where Paul Wilson came and ordered the curry that killed him. The restaurant owner, Mohammed Zaman, was fully aware of just how dangerous it is to put peanuts into a nut-free meal because just 2 weeks before Paul Wilson died, a 17-year-old girl went to another one of Zaman's restaurants just a few miles away from here, ordered a nut-free meal, and later that night she was hospitalised. Today, the girl's mother told me about seeing her daughter in a hospital bed.
Well, when I walked in, I didn't actually recognise her because she was actually covered her whole body with these purple hives. Her face had blown up, her nose, her throat and everything. She couldn't hear properly. So it was terrifying for me.
And you challenged the restaurant owner on this?
Yes, I did. And 3 times I asked them, do you have peanuts in your korma or your masala? And they assured me that no, they didn't.
Marianne reported Zaman to Trading Standards and they gave him a warning. That was just 1 week before Paul Wilson came in. The decision to keep using the cheaper peanut ingredient saved Zaman £5 per kilo, but it cost one of his customers their life. Peter Smith, ITV News, North Yorkshire.
Austria has come within a whisker of electing the EU's first far-right head of state. Norbert Hofer narrowly lost today to the former head of the Green Party in the country's presidential elections. But as our Europe editor James Mates reports from Vienna, the rise of the right has raised wider concerns.
Austria held its breath, much of Europe held its breath. The country's interior minister walked solemnly to the podium to declare whether the far right here have made the biggest electoral breakthrough since World War II.
Alexander van der Bellen entfallen 2.254.000.
By just 31,000 votes out of 4.5 million, Norbert Hofer of the Freedom Party had been kept out of the presidential palace, conceding defeat on his Facebook page, but promising his supporters he'll be back. The country's new president is the mild-mannered economics professor Alexander van der Bellen, backed originally by the Greens, but then by everybody as they tried to keep the far right out. His campaign, and now his elevation to the highest office, has seemed almost apologetic.
And a warm welcome to the guests from abroad. But you will excuse me, I hope, if I continue in German.
So Europe will breathe a sigh of relief, but cannot ignore the biggest lesson here: the collapse of the centre and the rise of the extremes of both left and right. Centrist politicians who face wipeout point out it's far from just an Austrian problem.
Should the rest of Europe be worried about this?
I think the entire Europe should worry about what is going on in entire Europe without specifically looking into in one country. It's not that what is going on in Austria is so much different from what is going on in very many other European countries.
At a party in a Vienna beer garden last night, Norbert Hofer was prematurely celebrating victory. But 49.7% of the vote for an extremist party is hardly a defeat. Others have combined to keep them out of power, but for how much longer?
So, James, will other European leaders be looking at this result from Austria and breathing a sigh of relief, do you think?
A huge sigh of relief. They really will feel that they have dodged a bullet here. What happened was a defeat for Norbert Hofer. He very narrowly got the keys to the presidential palace here, but look how much encouragement it'll give to other far-right leaders across Europe. Marine Le Pen, she's likely to get into the head-to-head runoff for the French president next year, according to the polls now. She will start believing she could actually win that if her counterpart here can do as well as this. Far-right parties growing in popularity, anti-immigrant, anti-Euro parties in Germany, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and this collapse of the centre we're seeing. Well, even the UK is not immune to that. What it is this feeling of endless economic problems and crisis, particularly in the Eurozone, combined with a feeling that whichever party you vote for, nothing much seems to change. And if Europe's leaders think that by dodging this bullet that the problem will now go away, well, it won't be long before we're in some other European capital reporting something very similar happening again.
All right, James Mates in Vienna, thank you.
The so-called Islamic State says it carried out a series of suicide and car bombings on government strongholds in Syria. It's thought that at least 100 people have been killed in 4 bombings which targeted bus stations in the coastal cities of Jabala and Tartus.
3 climbers have died on Mount Everest over the weekend from altitude sickness. Around 30 other mountaineers have suffered frostbite or become seriously ill in recent days as the spring climbing season comes to a close.
Now, we've done a lot on this programme about elephant and rhino poaching. Well, a Chinese businesswoman dubbed the Ivory Queen has appeared in court in Tanzania, accused of masterminding one of Africa's biggest elephant tusk smuggling rings.
Yes, Yang Fenglan is suspected of being the crucial link between the poaching gangs and illegal markets in China, where most of the illicit ivory ends up. From Tanzania, our Africa correspondent John Ray reports.
Hiding her face beneath her jacket, a woman whose trial promises to reveal much about a deadly trade. She is Yang Fenglan, better known as the Ivory Queen, a 66-year-old grandmother accused of trafficking more than 700 tusks worth £1.5 million. Tanzania's wildlife police claim she's their biggest catch yet, allegedly a crucial link between local poachers and powerful Chinese buyers. In a trade that in just 5 years has seen 60% of this country's elephants slaughtered.
It will be the first big victory for the anti-poaching communities and the first big victory for elephants. So it is extremely important.
Yet on Chinese state TV, Mrs. Yang is feted as a hero. For 40 years, they say, she's worked to improve business links between the two nations. But does that business also involve the sale of ivory, so valuable they call it white gold? Our own investigations in Tanzania's markets have shown who the best customers are.
Chinese, every time Chinese.
Investigators believe this case cracks open the criminal gangs that control the ivory trade, and that for the first time they have arrested a key figure, until now considered untouchable. She is undoubtedly well connected in both China and Tanzania.
This gentleman right now is a general of army.
So this man is a general in the Tanzanian army?
Yes.
but speaking to us on condition we do not show her face, her daughter insists on her mother's innocence.
We didn't do this. We didn't do any of these mistakes, no bad things to the elephant.
The investigation continues. If convicted, the Ivory Queen, dethroned, faces 20 to 30 years in jail. John Ray, ITV News, Tanzania.
And by the way, you can find out more on this subject from our series Stop the Slaughter, which is on our website at itv.com/news.
Still to come, meanwhile, in the ITV Evening News. The latest live from North Yorkshire, where councillors are deciding whether or not to approve fracking in England.
And look at this, a red carpet of poppies, the centrepiece of this year's Chelsea Flower Show.
But first, we should all be eating more fat to lose fat, a health charity claims. The National Obesity Forum says current dietary advice to reduce fat intake is wrong and failing to halt the expansion of Britain's waistlines. But public health bodies disagree, saying advising people to eat more high-fat foods is simply irresponsible. Well, our health editor Rachel Younger looks at yet more contrasting advice on what we should and should not eat.
Because so many women are concerned about too much saturated fat in daily meals.
When it comes to losing weight, we're bombarded with conflicting advice.
This is the amount of fat in that whole pizza.
But fat has long been seen as the enemy.
If you eat too much of this, then over time fatty deposits could build up in your arteries.
Which is why this consultant cardiologist has created a stir by claiming low-fat food can have disastrous consequences.
It's very clear the low-fat message does not help public health, it's not reduced heart disease, and in fact it's fueling an epidemic of type 2 diabetes and obesity.
The report from the National Obesity Forum calls for us to stop counting calories, ignoring the existing guidelines to stick to 2,000 daily for women and 2,500 for men. And it says limiting carbohydrates can prevent or reverse type 2 diabetes. The current advice is that only weight loss and exercise are effective. But the report looks at cases like Nigel's, a type 2 diabetic who's come off insulin and lost 3 stone since his GP put him on a low-carb, high-fat diet.
I feel so much better. I have so much more energy. And people have said, you know, you've been transformed in how you are and how you look. And that's great. You know, it's wonderful.
Proof you can eat fat to stay thin? Not according to the many scientists who've been quick to point out the advice we currently get comes from a robust review of all the available evidence. The fear now is that as a nation, our confusion over what to eat will spiral as fast as our weight.
The real problem is when you start telling people it actually doesn't matter how much you eat, whether you're having lots of calories or a few calories, and whether you're eating lots of fat. That really does matter because the evidence points very much to you then putting yourself at risk from heart disease.
It may not be what we want to hear, but the evidence you can lose weight by eating more fat remains, for now at least, rather on the thin side. Rachel Younger, ITV News.
Local councillors are currently deciding whether to grant the UK's first application for so-called fracking. Third Energy is applying to extract shale gas from an existing site near a village in North Yorkshire.
But hundreds of residents there are demanding it is turned down. Damon Green is outside the meeting tonight. So, Damon, this is an anxious wait then for the people there.
An anxious wait indeed. We're approaching the end of this long drawn-out planning process, and indications are this is going to be a very close vote indeed. We're standing outside County Hall listening to the councillors on that committee one by one saying whether they're in favour or against this proposal, and it's a very even split, and the tension here is easy to feel. Now, Third Energy, as you say, have applied for a permit to frack their site near Kirby Misperton on the edge of the North York Moors. They've been exploiting that site for natural gas for 20 years, but local residents don't want fracking. They say it will cause pollution, they say it will cause noise, traffic and potential contamination of the water table. And even though the local authority, their planning officers have recommended that the local authority approve this decision, there is still an awful lot of opposition here. As I say, one by one the councillors saying whether they're for or against it. We're expecting a final decision in the next hour.
Right, Damon Green in North Yorkshire, thank you.
The owner of Tata Steel has received final bids for its UK business and will decide on a shortlist within a few days. The business employs 11,000 people and supports a further 25,000 jobs at suppliers.
And Ryanair is to cut its fares by 7% this year. The budget airline, which is already making a healthy profit, says it wants to reduce its prices to encourage more people to fly.
Now, what a difference a couple of days make. Less than 48 hours after lifting the FA Cup, Louis van Gaal has been sacked as manager of Manchester United. And to make matters worse, he's about to be replaced by someone who used to work under him, Jose Mourinho. The Dutchman had a difficult relationship with players, fans and the media at United, but it was the lack of success in the Premier League and in Europe that ultimately cost him his job, as our sports editor Steve Scott reports.
Go home, go home. This saga has dragged on for so long. Ignoring questions about Manchester United is now second nature to Jose Mourinho, but not for much longer. The world might have been waiting for Old Trafford's official confirmation, but Mourinho's removal team certainly wasn't. The solicitor who negotiated David Moyes leaving cheque followed Louis van Gaal into United's training ground this morning. Ryan Giggs' future is uncertain, but he could yet prove a key ally for Mourinho, who may need some help convincing the doubters.
I think that what he's going to have to do is to adapt into the Manchester United ethos. He's going to have to say, I'm going to play the Manchester United way, and by doing that, he'll win supporters over, I'm sure.
Drills it in, fired in! All this just a couple of days after the Dutchman secured the club's first major silverware for 3 years. Success quickly followed by a tetchy, valedictory performance for the media.
I don't want to talk about leaving the club. I show you the cup and I don't discuss it with my friends of the media.
But the American owners had already made up their minds. It was time for change again. When Van Gaal was unveiled, who'd have predicted within 2 years he'd have lost the fans, the players, and now his job?
Managers come and go faster than ever. You know, the average manager hardly lasts a year now. That's the world we live in, I'm afraid.
As Van Gaal was driven away this afternoon, there was no comment, just a polite wave, his last act for the cameras on his very last day here.
So, Steve, it looks like Mourinho's the man. When do you expect official confirmation?
Well, I think the club will want to do it, Mark, as quickly as possible because the next man in has got quite a job on his hands. Having said that, Louis van Gaal left the United's training ground a few hours ago now and still no official word on his sacking from the club. But I think it's safe to say that football's longest-running courtship is about to move on to the next level. We know that Jose Mourinho's agent isn't due into the UK till Wednesday or Thursday this week, but that doesn't mean to say negotiations can't go on without him. In fact, I reckon a deal could be thrashed out as early as tomorrow. So to answer your original question, I think Mourinho could be wheeled out as the new manager of Manchester United at the earliest by the middle of this week.
All right, Steve, thanks very much indeed.
And finally tonight, to another Chelsea icon that's turned red. Hundreds of thousands of handmade poppies are being displayed at this year's Chelsea Flower Show.
It's a poignant and spectacular tribute to all those who have served in war. As Duncan Golestani explains, it was inspired by 2 Australian women who wanted to honour their fathers who fought in World War II.
It is the most eye-catching display at this year's show, a carpet of red stretching before the Royal Hospital Chelsea. Each poppy knitted and crocheted as a tribute to those who served in war. This evening, the Queen met the Australian women behind the installation. They wanted to honour their fathers by planting 120 poppies. They now have more than 250,000.
It's stunning in its own right, but to be able to have the privilege of having it in this backdrop is the thing that really, really, really makes it stand out for us. We're thrilled to be here, aren't we?
The fact that the Australian soldiers, if they got wounded, they were actually here during World War I and World War II. So they were actually in this hospital. And the fact that my father was a British soldier and Lynn's father was an Australian soldier, and it's kind of marrying things together. It's just beautiful.
The women accept that at some point the poppies will get wet, but they're happy to dry them out at the end of the show before taking them to Australia. There they will commemorate 100 years since the Battle of the Somme. Duncan Golostani, ITV News.
Just before we go, some breaking news. That fracking application in North Yorkshire has been approved. Tom Bradby will have more on that at 10.
All right, from all the team here. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.